but it was like... Well, a good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our first presentation in this series on stories of the Bible. So thank you all for coming, and for those who are even streaming online now. For those who haven't been here before, there are some toilets just in the foyer for where you might have come in, and we'll begin with a word of prayer. And we'll have a reading from Genesis chapter 12, and then David will do his presentation on Abraham, how one man became millions, and we'll really look forward to that presentation. And then at the end, I'll close with prayer, and then we have some a drink and some food there that we'd love you to stay around for those that are here. Sorry to those that are streaming. So we'll begin then with a word of prayer, if you just remain seated. Great God in highest heaven, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and of Jacob, We praise and honour your great name. We thank you for the privilege of prayer. We thank you that we can talk to you now and we can ask for your blessing as we read and as we hear your word. Father, we thank you for this time. Please help us in our endeavours to be more like your Son, Jesus. We leave this night in your care, praying through your Son, Jesus the Christ. Amen. Okay, as an introduction to David's presentation tonight, we're going to take a reading from Genesis chapter 12, the first 6 verses. So that's Genesis chapter 12. So in my Bible, it's on page 9, depending on what Bible you've got. And we'll ask Jeb to come up and read that. So that's Genesis 12, verse 1 to 6.
Genesis 12, verse 1 to 6. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran. And they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land.
Did well, Jeb. Thanks for that reading. So now I invite your attention as we hear David as he presents to us Abraham, the story in the Bible. Thank you.
Hit mute accidentally.
Okay, we'll keep going. So, but we've got a lot of people who claim that Abraham is their father. We've got the Jews who would claim that Abraham is their father. The Muslims claim that Abraham is their father. So he's a key man in the lives of a lot of people who are living today. And we'll see tonight, hopefully, that he can be a key man in our lives as well. But let's jump in and have a look at this story. So it's a big story. It takes up around 14 chapters in Genesis. So we won't have time tonight to go into great depth into everything that Abraham does in this story, but we're just going to pick a few bits and pieces and then just have a look at how this incredible story unfolds. Now, the beginning of the story is in Genesis chapter 11. And just so you know, as we go through, I've got most of the key verses up on the projector, so feel free to turn up the quotes yourself, but I'll be putting most of the verses up here just so we can flow through this story a bit better. So we read this in Genesis chapter 11. This is the account of Terah. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Abram and Nahor took wives for themselves. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai. Now, who is this man Abram? Abram is in fact Abraham. We'll see later in the story that his name gets changed to Abraham. His name gets changed when he's 99 years old. So for most of his life he was known as Abram. Sarai is his wife. Sarai also gets her name changed to Sarah. So we probably are more familiar with the names Abraham and Sarah, and you'll hear me using these names interchangeably as I go through. But right up until Abram is 99 years old, his name is Abram. So here is the first mention of Abram in the Bible. He's the son of Terah. And Sarai, strangely enough, was also the daughter of Terah. So she had a different mother to Abraham. That sounds a little bit weird, very weird in fact. But back in those times, it was not too uncommon. It happened, and the genetic pool, as they say, was a little bit more wide open, and so it didn't pose the same sort of problems and risks as it does today. So there you go. So Abram and Sarai are married, and they live in a place called Ur of the Chaldeans. It's in the Middle East, and it's where modern-day Iraq is today. So that's where they grew up. And it was a great city. So it was a very prosperous city. There was a lot of money in the place. There's evidence of incredible buildings, of incredible temples and all these sorts of things. And it's very likely that Abram and Sarai were very well off. They probably did very well for themselves and were quite secure in their lives. Now, as far as the religious aspect of the city goes, it was not a particularly godly place, so people weren't serving God, but it was a very, very superstitious place. There was a lot of gods that people would create, so man-made gods. There was one god in particular that Abram and Sarai would have worshipped and bowed down to in Ur, and it was called the moon god, and his name was Sin, oddly enough, S-I-N, Sin. So there you go. So that's who Abram and Sarai would have grown up worshipping in their lives. It was a place full of gods, but it was godless in every way. And for Abram and Sarai, despite living in this very prosperous city and being quite well off for themselves, life was far from easy. We read this about Sarai. But Sarai was barren. She had no children. For a woman living in today's times who can't have children, it's a very, very difficult thing to come to grips with. It's really a devastating thing in today's times. But today we have the benefit of science. There's things like IVF. But obviously in these times, the times where Sarai and Abram were living, there was nothing like that at all. And back then it was really considered, a woman who grew up and couldn't have children, it was considered like a curse. That's the way it was looked at. It's looked at probably differently today, but it was considered like a curse. And it was this curse that Sarai would live with. For women, having a baby or having a child was seen as sort of their main purpose, their main reason that they were called to do, called to live. And so everyone would have known that Sarai was barren. Everywhere she went, people would have known this. This was the woman who had this curse that she couldn't have children. And so this was something that Abram and Sarai had to carry around. There would have been a lot of grief coming to terms with this. And you can imagine, can't you, in this superstitious place of Ur, Sarai and Abram bowing down to their moon god Sin and begging that this God that they were worshipping might grant them to have a child. Even though it seemed so unlikely, they would have tried their very best to try and change this situation, but they couldn't. And there was no one for Abram to pass on this inheritance to. And that was another big deal back then. It was about passing on your inheritance, the things that you had accumulated, the land that you had. The big deal was passing that on to a seed, someone who could take that, who could take on your name, take on your possession, and so your family name would live on. And so it was a very big thing back then. And so when Genesis 12 picks up the story of Abram, we don't know exactly how old Abram is. We do know that Abram is 10 years older than Sarai. And I would guess, based on how the story goes, that Abram's around 65 years old and Sarai is about 55 years old. And then in steps God. We read, "Now the Lord had said to Abram, 'Get out of your country, from your family and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation, I will bless you, and I will make your name great. And you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed.'" And so we read this in Genesis 12, and this is just like, it's like out of the blue. It's like, wow, where did this come from? God appears to Abraham, and he has this vision, and God says, "I'm going to give you all of these blessings." Up to this point, Abram and Sarai had felt like their lives were cursed. That's really how they felt. Their life was cursed. But God says, "I'm going to turn that curse into blessings." Blessings that you could never have imagined. But you need to leave all your superstitions behind, the moon god Sin, and you need to trust in me. That's what Abram is being told here. You need to leave this godless place, this superstitious place, and come to a new land that will be revealed. Now, what God is promising to Abram here is really broken up into three parts. This is the promise that's been made. There's a personal promise to Abram. God says, "I will bless you and I will make your name great." That's what God said to Abram. Anyone who treats you poorly, Abram, I will treat them poorly. Anyone who treats you well, they will also be treated well. That's the promise that God made to Abram. Then there's a bigger promise than that. He says to Abram, "I will make you into a great nation." Now, Abram would have done anything just to have one child. He would have given anything to have one child. And God says, "I'm going to do more than that. I'm going to make of you a great nation. A huge multitude of people is going to come from you, Abram." And then finally, the promise goes even beyond Abram and the nation that would come from Abram. God says this is going to be a worldwide promise. In fact, in you or from you, every nation on earth will be blessed. Every nation on earth will be blessed. All people on earth will be blessed through this one man, Abraham. What an incredible set of blessings that is, or promises. Now, why has God chosen Abram as the one to give such great promises to? What was it about Abram? Why this man, at this time in life, has God chosen Abram to give all these blessings to? Now, we don't know exactly why, but God saw something in this man. But to this point, he was a godless man who spent time worshipping many other gods apart from the one true God. As we follow Abram's story, we see that he's a flawed character. Like many of us here are flawed characters. We're humans. Abram is human just like everyone else. In fact, he does things that actually make you shake your head at times and think, why, Abram? Why are you doing this? But here is a man who's lost hope of his inheritance. He's lost hope in man-made gods. And the one true God says, if you trust me, I will turn that curse into blessings that will extend to all people on earth. Abram wasn't a man with superhero qualities, and that's good to remember as well. That is not why God called Abram. It wasn't because he was this incredibly outstanding person that lived an incredibly noble life. That wasn't Abram. And we'll see that that wasn't Abram. That's not why God chose him. And as we look through the Bible, we'll see that there are very few superheroes in the Bible. There are people, men and women, who reach incredible heights, but the same men and women also reach incredible lows. They're humans. But God says that he can work with humans. And it's incredible what God can do with this man. He doesn't need superheroes. God needs people who are willing to trust and believe him. And that's the point of this story. That's why he's called Abram. To demonstrate or to tell a story that shows what is possible for God to achieve through a man who has just enough faith to leave his home, to leave his family, and to follow God into a land that he knows nothing about. That's what this story is. And so Abram and Sarai pack up their things and they take off, trusting in this new life that is in front of them. And we read this. And Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and they went out with them from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan, and they came to Haran and dwelt there. So he's left his homeland, but he hasn't exactly left his family. Terah, his dad, goes along, as well as Lot, his nephew. Lot's dad had died. Lot's dad's name was Haran, funnily enough, the place where they end up at. And so it's possible that Abram was like a father figure to Lot. So Lot went along as well as Sarai. And there are family links in Haran. So Abram's brother had lived there before he passed away. And there was an element of comfort here in Haran. It's a long journey, so it's about 600 miles from where they live in Ur. So it's a long journey, but there's familiarity in this place. In Haran, they worshipped the same gods. So they worshipped this moon god Sin. So the culture was similar. Abram would have been known. Their name would have been known. People would have welcomed them into this place. Now, we don't know how long they spent there, but it seems that it's indicating that they spent years there rather than months. But following the death of Terah, that's when Abram decides to depart this place. And we read in Genesis 12, so Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And we read, then Abram took Sarai his wife and Lot his brother's son and all their possessions that they had gathered and the people whom they had acquired in Haran, and they departed to go to the land of Canaan. So they came to the land of Canaan. Now, can you imagine how Abram must have been feeling as he led this small group of people into this unknown place of Canaan? He didn't know anyone there. He didn't have any family there. He had no connections like he did in Haran. Everywhere he went, he would have been treated suspiciously. People would have known them as the foreigners, this weird group of people travelling around. And people would have been very wary of them. What are they doing here? What are they up to? Now remember, this is very different to the times that we're living in. If we're planning on travelling somewhere, we can jump on the internet and we can do our research. We can look at where the good places to go are. We can look at the scary places to avoid. We can learn about the culture. We can learn about the money there. We can go and we can exchange our money into the local currency. We can prepare ourselves. Abram is walking blindly into this place. He knows very little about this place, apart from the fact that Canaan was quite a dangerous place. the people living in Canaan at this time were not good living, godly people. There were dangers in this place, and Abram knew that. And at various times, Abram fears for his life as he travels around this new area of Canaan. Now, for those who don't know, Canaan is where the land of Israel is today. It was known as the land of Canaan. But as God has promised Abram, he would look after him and he would fend for him and would bless everyone who blessed him. And so this small group of travellers head down to Canaan. It was another 400 miles journey from Haran. And the first place they end up is a place called Shechem. And there we read that the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your descendants I will give this land." And there he built an altar to the Lord who appeared to him. So he was a stranger now, but he believed that the land that he stood on one day would be his possession. And the generations that would come from Abraham, would possess this land, and it would be in their possession. Now the story of Abram it's a long one. And as I said, we don't have time to go into all the details. But really, it's a story where Abram faces challenge after challenge. And through each of these challenges, he learns that the only way to get through them is to trust in God and the promises that God has made him. And each time that Abram trusts in God, God manages to turn each one of these challenges into a blessing. Now, there are a few times where Abram makes poor decisions. And because of those poor decisions, Abram gets himself into some really, really difficult positions. And he creates for himself these problems that he can't get out of. And each time God will step in to those problems and he will turn those problems into blessings. And what's interesting is that instead of God getting angry with Abram as he makes these bad decisions, instead of God threatening Abram that unless you clean up your act, those promises, you can forget those. I'll take those promises away. God never says that once. In fact, in all of these situations that Abram gets himself into because of his bad decisions, God turns all of those things into blessings. Here's an example in Genesis chapter 12. So we have a famine in the land. And what Abram should have done is he probably should have just waited in the land of Canaan and trusted that God would provide for him, that God would provide food for him and his family. But instead of that, what Abram decides to do is he decides to head right down south through the land of Canaan, where he came to Egypt. And there was obviously food to be had in Egypt. But as Abram does this, he's scared for his safety. And the reason why he's scared for his safety is actually because of the beauty of his wife Sarai. Now, Sarai, don't forget, is 65 years old at this time, so that in itself is quite remarkable that at 65 years old, she's still drawing a lot of attention. So she must have been a very beautiful woman who's aged very well. But he tells Sarai, he says, "Listen, if anyone asks about you, what we're going to say is that you're my sister. We're not going to tell people that you're my wife." Now it was not a lie in itself. We know that that she was Abram's half-sister, but it was deceptive. And Abram was scared that if the men of Egypt found out that he was her husband, the husband of this beautiful woman, that they would kill him, that they would kill Abram and then take Sarai. So anyway, they head down to Egypt, and really, that's exactly what happens. As soon as they arrive in Egypt, Sarai is noticed very quickly by the locals, and in fact, Pharaoh himself, one of the most powerful men in the world, ends up requesting that she joins him in his palace. And so things get out of hand very quickly. And so what Pharaoh does is he starts laying on the gifts to Abram. He's so thankful to Abram, Sarai's brother, for this beautiful woman. So we read that he treated Abram very well on account of her. Abram received sheep and cattle, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, and camels. Now, this was no small gift at all. This was a significant gift. Pharaoh is laying on the gifts to Abram. And as Abram sees these gifts show up one after another, he is thinking, oh no, what on earth have I got myself into? How do I get out of this one? Now, apparently the custom was that when Pharaoh took in a woman who he wanted to marry, they would actually spend about 2 months in the palace, cut off from everyone else, just to make sure that she wasn't pregnant and that he would find out about that later. So to take that completely off the table, he would shut them up for a couple of months in his palace. So that's where Sarai is right now. Can you imagine how she's feeling? But God comes to the rescue to clean up Abram's mess. In verse 17 we read that the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh, once he understands exactly what's going on and the reason why he's been plagued and the fact that Abram has lied to him, he calls in Abram and he says, "What on earth were you thinking, Abram? What on earth were you thinking lying to me and creating this mess for me? And can you imagine the disaster that this could have created, Abram?" And he sends Abram away. He says, "Take your things and go. You can get out of this place and don't come back." And so instead of Abram being killed by Pharaoh for lying to him, he leaves with this bevy of gifts. All these gifts that Pharaoh had lavished on Abram. He leaves with all those things and he gets Sarai back. Now, surely you would think that would be the first and last time you would make such a mistake. Surely you wouldn't make that mistake again. But Abram does, believe it or not. Many years later in his life, he makes almost the identical mistake as that. This time, it was when he was coming to a place called Gerar. We'd read Genesis chapter 20. We read that Abraham said about his wife Sarah, "She is my sister." So Abimelech, who was king of Gerar, sent for Sarah and took her. She was still a very beautiful lady. She attracted attention. So this time, this king Abimelech quickly asks about this Sarai and says, "Fantastic, she's single," and he takes her. Now God immediately sent a curse on all the women in the house of Abimelech, and that curse was that it made them infertile. So he appears in a dream to Abimelech, warning that he and his family will be destroyed if he does not immediately return Sarah to Abraham. And it's interesting that here, that this little white lie that Abram's told again is now affecting and bringing harm on other people. It's caused all the women to be infertile. And I think that would have hit home pretty hard to Abraham, because that is the curse that he's dealt with. He's lived with infertility through Sarai, and now his lie has caused that same curse to come upon all these innocent people. So Abimelech pleads his innocence to God, saying that he had no idea whatsoever about this lie that Abraham had told, and God removes the curse. And so God again comes to the rescue of Abraham and Sarah. Not only does God just let them off the hook, but look what happens. So Abimelech gave sheep, cattle, and male and female servants to Abraham. He also gave his wife Sarah back to him. Then Abimelech said, "Look, my land is before you. Live wherever you please. Go and pick a spot for yourself, Abraham, and you can have it. It's yours. And here, have all these gifts." Now, what's interesting is that there's no instance of God reprimanding Abraham, is there? For telling this lie and bringing Sarah and all these people into harm's way. But I don't think he has to. I think in both cases, it's actually these supposed evil men that Abraham feared his life from that are the ones that do the reprimanding. And they say, "What are you thinking, Abraham, telling us this lie?" And that would have been hard to take for Abraham. Now, we all have weaknesses, and Abraham does too. And he had to front up to those mistakes like we have to front up to our mistakes. But the lesson here is that God didn't cut Abraham off, nor did he go back on his promises. God didn't choose Abraham because he was this faultless character. He chose Abraham in spite of all of his weaknesses. And that's where the true power of this story comes out. He chose Abraham in spite of all of his flaws in character. And he does that to highlight a quality that he valued more. And the quality that he valued more was faith. And that's what Abraham shows. He makes mistakes, but he shows incredible faith. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to fast forward a little bit. So I'm just going to show you just a summary of what we're going to fast forward through, because we're going to go to chapter 16 and carry on the story there. But in this time, these are just some of the things that have happened to Abram. He grows in wealth and prosperity. So he's doing very well for himself. And his little group of people are growing more and more and more. And Lot, his nephew, and Abram, they decide to go separate ways. So because they're getting so big, Abram decides that it's getting a bit impractical. So many people travelling together. He says that the land's not supporting all of these people. And there was little arguments breaking out between Lot's servants and Abram's servants. And so Abram says to Lot, look, you go, you choose where you want to live, and then I will go in the opposite direction. And so what happens is that Lot looks around and he looks into the distance and he sees this incredibly green place. It's all desert everywhere, and he looks and he sees this beautiful fertile green place and he says, that's where I want to go. If you don't mind, Abram, I'm going to choose that spot. And that spot was Sodom. Now, Lot would end up regretting that decision that he made. That decision that he made without consulting God whatsoever. But Abram, he's growing in faith. And he knows that it doesn't matter where Lot chose because he trusts in God. He'll go wherever. It doesn't matter. God will be with him. And so he says, sure, Lot, you go. I'll go in the opposite direction. No worries. But then, not long after Lot moves to Sodom, an army comes down and invades Sodom. And Lot and his family become prisoners of war. And Abram gets word of this. Now, Abram could have washed his hands and said, look, I'm sorry, Lot, but, you made that decision to go down there. I've got people to fend for. I've got a family. And you need to sort out your own mess. But that's not what Abram does. Abram comes down with 318 men and he destroys an army which wasn't just one army. This army that Abram destroys it's four kings and their armies all together as one. And we don't know exactly how many people it was, but it would have been so much more than the numbers that Abram showed up with. And Abram destroys them. And not only does he do that, all the spoils that he had from that, he takes and he gives to Sodom. And the king of Sodom comes to Abram and says, look, Abram, you've just saved us. You've saved our nation. You take some of the spoils. That's the least I could offer you. And Abram says, I don't want a thing. You take all of it. And he says, the reason why I want you to take all of it is because when people look at me and my prosperity, I don't want people to say that I got that prosperity from anyone else except God. So you can see Abram is growing in faith through all of these challenges and all these events that are happening to him. It's an incredible story. But the main story for Abram, the main thing that is on his mind is that there is still no child. There is still no child. And they're not getting any younger at all. Sarai is getting older by the day. He's getting older by the day. When is this child going to come? And so we come to Genesis chapter 16. And Sarai she's getting particularly impatient. And she doubts, or she probably does more than doubt. So I think she she's giving up any hope that this promised child, who is going to turn into a nation of people, she believes that that's not going to be from her. And so she comes up with a plan. She says, so after Abram had lived in Canaan for 10 years, Sarai, Abram's wife, gave Hagar, her Egyptian servant, to her husband to be his wife, and she became pregnant. So Sarai was about 75 years old. It's been 10 years since they first arrived in this land of Canaan. There's no signs at all that would suggest anything other than she's barren. How much longer could they keep waiting? And you can see how they came to this decision. I mean, God's made the promise, and you could, after 10 years, and there's still no sign that this is going to happen, you might start thinking, well, maybe we need to get a little bit proactive here. Maybe God wants us to just maybe contribute to this promise a little bit, to maybe get involved somewhat. And maybe the fact that we went to Egypt and Pharaoh gave us these servants, maybe God did that for a reason. Maybe Hagar, who has grown up now, who was one of the servants who Pharaoh had given to Abram and Sarai, maybe God put Hagar there for a reason. You can see that thought process. And they make the decision that Abram is going to take Hagar and they're going to have a baby. And that's what happens. Hagar becomes pregnant. Now, as soon as Hagar is found pregnant, things turn ugly. And Sarai resents her. And she starts treating her very harshly. She isn't happy at all for Abraham going through with this. And even though she was the one who came up with this idea, it's funny, isn't it? How that happens, and so Abraham, he should have known better. He really should have known better. This was a mistake that Abraham made, and also a mistake that he has to come to grips with. So what happens is Hagar takes off. She's sick and tired of being treated poorly by Sarai, and she says, I'm out of here. Now, she runs into the desert. She's pregnant, and she just runs into the desert. And I think that just gives us some indication of how tough life must have been for Hagar to make the decision that I'm better off running into a desert with nothing than staying in this household. And that's what she does. But when she's there in the desert, an angel finds her and instructs her to return back to Abraham and Sarai, and that she would be blessed, that Hagar would be blessed with a child, Ishmael, who would in fact become a multitude too numerous to count. And as history shows, Ishmael was the father of the Arabs. And so, in verse 15, so Hagar gave birth to Abram's son, whom Abram named Ishmael. Now, Abram was 86 years old when Hagar gave birth to Ishmael. Then we read the very next verse, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him. So between verses, we have 13 years of nothing. 13 years of silence. 13 years is a long time. Ishmael's growing up, the son who would be blessed. Sarai is now 89 years old. Now, we don't know exactly what happens in these 13 years, apart from a very tense family life, especially with this difficult relationship between Hagar and Sarai. This was now a divided home. And like any of us would have done in this situation, Abram starts to wonder. He starts to wonder, now after 23 years since they moved from Haran, he starts to wonder if this promised child is ever going to happen. And he's struggling to believe in his own ability to conceive a child now, let alone his wife, who is 89 years old. And what he starts doing is he starts hoping and wishing that maybe God is going to change his plans with Ishmael. And he hopes and he wishes that maybe God is going to say that Ishmael is the one, Abram. Ishmael is him. Abram clearly loved Ishmael, and that's what he hopes. And he even pleads to God that that's the case. He says to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." And it's clear that Abram loved him. And he thought this whole thing would be easier if Ishmael was the one. So God in chapter 17, what he does is he actually finally changes Abram's name. And he says in verse 5, which is here, he says, "No longer will your name be Abram. Instead, your name will be Abraham, because I will make you the father of a multitude of nations." Now, Abraham means the father of a multitude. And that's what God is promising to Abraham. And then in verse 15, then God said to Abraham, "As for your wife, you must no longer call her Sarai. Sarah will be her name. I will bless her and will give you a son through her. I will bless her and she will become a mother of nations. Kings of countries will come from her." Then Abraham bowed down his face to the ground and laughed. Abraham laughed. This laughter was a laughter of disbelief. Abraham wants to believe, but it's been 24 years now since he left Haran, and this whole thing just seems laughable. And I think this is the first time where we see Abram truly doubt God. Abraham, he truly doubts whether God is going to come through and this is actually going to happen. And he laughs in disbelief. So, he's not the only one who's laughing. In the next chapter, 3 angels come and visit Abraham and Sarah. And these 3 angels tell the news to Abraham, just like God has told him here, that this very time next year, Sarah will have given birth to a son named Isaac. And we read that, so Sarah laughed as well. In Genesis 18 verse 13, we read, "The Lord said to Abraham, 'Why did Sarah laugh and say, will I really have a child when I am old? Is anything impossible for the Lord? I will return to you when the season comes around again, and Sarah will have a son.' Is anything impossible for the Lord?" This is the lesson that Abraham will learn. Nothing is impossible for God. That is what he's going to teach him. Now, the name Isaac means he laughs. That's what Isaac means. Both Abraham and Sarah laughed in disbelief, but when this boy is born, that laughter would signal complete joy. Just realised that clock's not working. What's the time? 8:15. So Isaac, this boy, would forever be a reminder that nothing is impossible for God. That's the mark that Isaac would leave. Nothing is impossible for God. Keep trusting in God, Abraham. And so we come to Genesis chapter 21. We fast forward a little bit to Genesis chapter 21. And in this chapter, we have Abraham, who experiences the greatest of joys, the greatest of feelings, but also some pain, some absolute pain in this same chapter. So we read, "So Sarah became pregnant and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the appointed time that God had told him. Abraham named his son, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. Now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has made me laugh. Now, this wasn't the same laughter that her and Abraham had laughed previously with disbelief in their hearts. This was pure laughter from pure joy at how incredible this miracle was, and also how incredible God is to perform this impossible thing that he's promised. Now, as Isaac grew up and he was weaned, and that would probably be after a few years, they would throw this party. And it was a common thing that they would do. So when the child stopped breastfeeding and moved to solid food, they would throw this party. And so in chapter 21, they prepare for this party. And as they were preparing for this party, Sarah looks and notices this. She notices, as it says, the son of Hagar the Egyptian, the son of whom Hagar had borne to Abraham, mocking. So she said to Abraham, banish that slave woman and her son, for the son of that slave woman will not be an heir alongside my son Isaac. And this sin that Sarah and Abraham had taken part in, when they took matters into their own hands, comes back to hit very hard. And as this intense joy that Abraham is feeling when it comes to his son Isaac, he feels that the most hurtful emotions when it comes to this. Now notice that Sarah doesn't even mention the boy's name, Ishmael. To her, all Sarah could see was the child of Hagar, this Egyptian slave, and she wants them both gone. She had become so bitter towards this woman, and she couldn't even acknowledge that boy Ishmael. And this probably wasn't the first time that she'd requested this to Abraham. Get rid of them, Abraham. Why are they still here? But possibly Abraham had argued that it was God's plan. Possibly it was God's plan that Ishmael is the chosen child. Should Sarah, in fact, not be able to conceive? And for years, she carries this bitterness within herself every time that she looks at Hagar. But now, Isaac has arrived, the promised child, the heir. Now there's no need in Sarah's mind for Ishmael and Hagar to hang around any longer. Now we read that Sarah's demand, it says, displeased Abraham greatly because Ishmael was his son. This would be one of the most difficult things for Abraham to do, to say goodbye to his son Ishmael, who he loved. And Abraham was torn. He didn't know what to do. But God encourages Abraham to let them go. And God said, they will be leaving under my guidance, Abraham. I will look after them. I will bless them. And in fact, he makes a promise that Ishmael would become a great nation. And so we read that Abraham, early in the morning, took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He put them on her shoulders, gave her the child, and sent her away. He sends them away with just a skin of water and a small amount of food. And he knows that he can send them away with very little because God will protect them. God will be with them and God will bless them as they go. And he has great faith in his God. And so we come to Genesis chapter 22. And if Abraham's life was made into a movie and we were sitting down and we were watching this movie or this story for the first time, this would be the twist that no one would see coming. This is an incredible twist in this story of Abraham. Because in Genesis chapter 22, we read this. Sometime after these things, God tested Abraham. God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah. Offer him up there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I will indicate to you. Early the next morning, Abraham gets up and he saddles the donkey. He takes 2 of his servants along with him, along with his son Isaac. He gets wood together for the burnt offering and sets out in complete faith. Now, this is something that I struggle to get my head around. I really do. How can Abraham do this? And how can God do this to Abraham? After 24 years, 25 years, after leaving Haran, finally God blesses Abraham and Sarah with this child Isaac. Finally, they've got this child who they love. He's their most precious possession. And he grows up, and he's probably about 12, maybe 15 years old at this time. And God says, I want you to take that boy and I want you to offer him as a burnt offering. Now, how can we get our heads around this? And how can Abraham get his head around this? How can he seemingly not even hesitate? And that's how it reads. He doesn't even hesitate. The first sign of daylight, he's up and he's getting ready and he's going. And he doesn't even wait for God to change his mind. He doesn't ask for any clarification. He doesn't ask for an explanation from God. He just goes. How does Abraham do this? How does Abraham do this? Well, it's in the name of Isaac, isn't it? It's in the name of Isaac. Abraham was never, ever going to laugh in disbelief again. He had learnt the lesson. Nothing is impossible with God. That is the faith that Abraham now has. Nothing is impossible with God. And what Abraham has learnt through all of life's ups and downs over the last 40 years or so is that God has always come through for him. Even when the odds have been stacked completely against him, God has turned every trial into a blessing, each and every time. Abraham trusts God. He doesn't question God. He goes. And he has faith that whatever happens up on that mountain, God is going to turn that into another blessing. So he sets off on this 3-day journey. We read, and Abraham said to his young men, as they get to the 3rd day of their journey, stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. Abraham has confidence that whatever happens on that mountain, that they will both return. It wasn't going to be just Abraham coming back. He knows that whatever happens, he and Isaac are going to return back down that mountain, and he has faith in that. He doesn't know how, but he trusts God. And that's what happens as he sets up this altar and he ties up Isaac and he puts him on the altar, and as he lifts up his hand, he hears a voice. He hears the voice of an angel. And this voice says, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his thorns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. So here we have it. The most triumphant moment in Abraham's life. He had trust in God to the point that he was willing to kill his own son whom he loved, knowing that God would somehow turn that into a blessing. And that becomes an illustration of the greatest faith that you can have. To be willing to give up your most precious possession, the most precious thing that you hold dear to you, and give that up in faith to God. And the rest, as they say, is history. So Sarah dies after living a life of 126 years. Abraham would continue to live for another 39 years before passing away at 175 years. And he remained faithful to God to the end. Isaac grew and had 2 boys, Jacob and Esau. Jacob, who was chosen, would have 12 sons, who would form the 12 tribes of Israel, and eventually under Moses and then Joshua would take the land of Canaan to be their homeland, just like God had promised. God's promises to Abraham that he would become the father of nations came true. But it wasn't complete there. Through Abraham, all nations on earth would be blessed. How was that possible? Well, then we read this. Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Jesus himself, the Son of God, the Saviour of the world, would come from Abraham's line. Abraham's life was integral to the whole history of mankind and God's future plan. Abraham is not just the father of Isaac or the father of Israel. We're told that Abraham is the father of the faithful. And the proof was his willingness to sacrifice his own son. And this family of faith, would be a family that would not be a family based on genetics or where someone was born or their family tree. It was the family of God who would have the same key attribute as Abraham, and that is faith in God. And that is your calling, and that is my calling. Abraham is your father, and Abraham is my father, should we have faith in God. Now, if there is one key verse in the whole of Abraham's long and incredible story that I think is the key verse in the whole thing, I believe it's this. In Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, we read this. Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord credited this for righteousness. Now that might seem like a strange verse to put up as the key verse, but let's think about this. Because it's the crucial verse in Abraham's story, and it's also a crucial verse in our story as well. Because here we can understand the basis of God's relationship with Abraham and the basis of God's relationship with us. And then what God is willing to do as a result. We read that Abraham believed. He believed God. He trusted God, even when what God has promised seemed unlikely in human terms. And because Abraham believed, he credited this for righteousness. Or in other words, God said, Abraham, I'm going to consider you a perfect person. I'm going to look over all of your faults, all of the bad decisions you made, all the lies that you have told. Because you have faith in me, I'm going to consider you a perfect person. That's what he does for Abraham. That's what faith is. It's believing that God will do what God has said he will do for you and for me. And God says that this is the very basis of the relationship between himself and mankind. He isn't calling for superheroes. He's calling for people who believe him and trust in him. In Romans chapter 4, a man named Paul wrote these words. He says about Abraham, he did not waver in unbelief about the promise of God, but was strengthened in faith, giving glory to God. He was fully convinced that what God had promised, he was also able to do. So indeed, it was credited to Abraham as righteousness. Abraham looked at himself, an old man, and his wife, an old lady, and he believed that from these bodies that felt like they were dead, lifeless bodies, that God would bring life from him, a child from him, which a whole nation would be born. But what is it that God has promised that he has done for you and for me? We read this. But the statement, it was credited credited to him was not written only for Abraham's sake, but also for our sake, to whom it was credited. Those who believe in the one who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead. He was given over because of our transgressions and was raised for the sake of our justification. So what has God done for us? He allowed his Son to die for you and for me, and he raised him to life again. That we are no longer dying creatures, but we are alive together with a risen Jesus. God says that if we are able to believe that, and if we're able to demonstrate that belief by simply going into the waters of baptism, if we are able to believe that God has done that for us through the death of his own Son, then he will overlook every one of our flaws and consider us perfect, just like he would look over Abraham's flaws and consider him perfect. Through faith, we too will be blessed like faithful Abraham.
Well, thanks, David. On your behalf, I thank David again for his presentation, and what a gripping story it is. And yes, you wouldn't read about it with these plot twists, but we can. So take the time now. We'll close with a word of prayer, and then you can come up and have a chat with Dave later if you've got any further questions. As far as announcements are concerned, next week, God willing, we're going to go back in time a little bit to Noah and have a look at some earlier chapters and hear about the story of Noah. And also that'll be next Tuesday at 7:30. And on Sunday nights, if you're near a radio, tune into 88.7 FM. We have Sunday nights at 8 p.m, there's a 1-hour radio program, so you can have a listen on Coast FM. We'll close with a word of prayer. Dear God in highest heaven, God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, we thank you for this time that we can read your written word. See that you're involved in Abraham and Sarah's life, that you were just looking for faith, a small, tangible faith that would obey your word. And we've seen tonight that you did look after Abraham and Sarah, and that you can look after us, because you loved the world and sent your only begotten Son. Thank you for this time. We thank you for the food and the drink that has been provided. We are mindful of those who are sick and ill at this time, and those who have little. Please, Father, look after them wherever they are in the world. The world needs your care and needs you to step in. And so we do pray for that prophecy to be fulfilled of your Son to return to this earth. And it is through his name we pray, Jesus the Christ. Amen.